Hello and welcome to the Justice Sector. National Assembly Speaker Baleka Mbete must go. This is the call by 5 opposition parties. And with the issue up for debate in Parliament this week, UDM leader Bantu Holomisa tells us why his party is joining the call. After that, we name and shame our loser of the week. We don't have a winner this week, but we do have 2 huge losers of the week. But first, we take a look at the controversial Oscar Pistorious murder judgment and discuss the gender issues raised by this judgment. My guests are Sisonke Msimang from Sisonke Gender Justice and Lisa Vetten from the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. Lisa, let me start with you. Why is this case so troubling? Why is it so worrying?
I think we must look at the case in 2 different ways. The one is it does have general implications for cases where somebody claims that they shot someone accidentally. Those are not specific to domestic violence cases necessarily. And this decision is troubling because it does suggest that the judge may not have thought so carefully about who was behind that door and whether or not Oscar could reasonably have foreseen that he was shooting anybody, let alone Reeva. This case is to some extent, the other way it's troubling is that I think there is some perception that this case is typical and representative of domestic violence, intimate femicide cases, and that it sets a very bad precedent for those cases specifically. But that's not necessarily correct. And I think that people have not necessarily gotten a particularly good idea of what actually goes on in the typical intimate femicide case. And so my concern from that is, by investing so much in one case, we might just be overlooking the many other broader gender issues that get raised in intimate femicide.
Sisonke, what does it raise for you, before I come back to Lisa's point?
I think Lisa's right, although I think, on the other hand, there are ways in which I think, because it was a celebrity case, because there was so much interest, because there was so much public attention to the case, many of us in the gender sector were hoping that it would allow society an opportunity to think more carefully about gender issues and to understand some of the ways in which the criminal justice system might be able to work for women. And I think because of the celebrity factor, because of the interest, we hoped that would be the case. And I think Lisa is right, it hasn't been the case.
Hasn't it worked for women, this case, at all? Hasn't it shown up some of the issues you raised?
I think one of the issues that it has made very, very prominent is the fact that the majority of women in this country, when they are murdered, die at the hands of their intimate male partners. That fact has been brought home very clearly to people, and I think they've had an insight into the kind of heartbreak and impact of such homicides. What I don't think it's necessarily done is open up the context of domestic violence broadly, or look at what happens in these cases. So I think I'd like to just talk a little bit about
yes,
the
do
general,
that. Open that up for me.
Sure. Because I think in the typical intimate femicide case tends to revolve around questions of control, and in particular the man's attempts to control the woman's behavior in a whole range of different ways. And often it's focused on her sexuality, how she may express it, who she can choose to go out with, whatever. So many of these killings, when they occur within a context of jealousy, where the man claims the woman's being unfaithful, or she's trying to leave him. So typically they will argue, I was provoked. And so many of these trials focus subtly and not so subtly on the woman's conduct and character, and they rubbish her. That is, I think, and that tends to be a very disturbing gendered phenomenon. The other thing they do is they tend to argue that men who kill their female partners suffer from strange and exotic mental states, which means they shouldn't be held responsible for their conduct. We sort of saw Oscar going in that direction, but didn't go there. So it's very different to those cases. It's more similar to a subset.
Let me stop you there.
Okay.
I'm going to come to you, Sisonke, but a woman dies in a house in Pretoria. She dies at the hands of her partner. He has and this has been alluded to or pointed at directly during the trial, he has a certain history with violence and issues around women as well. Surely it's the same thread that you allude to.
You see, this is the difficulty with this trial, is that if you look at it from a legal perspective, I think the evidence of the nature of their relationship is not particularly clear and robust. Now, in this sort of trial, you can't typically bring in a prior history of the relationship or relationships with other people, because legally that would be considered the prejudice to outweigh its evidentiary value. So one couldn't bring that in. All you had were those few SMSs. And so when weighed against the larger context of the relationship, it couldn't really, I think, sustain an argument that this was an abusive relationship. And I think the other difficulty faced here was that because the relationship was fairly short, you couldn't see if these worrying signs had actually become an entrenched feature and characteristic of the relationship. So I think the state, from a legal point of view, had quite limited threads to work with in trying to draw together that particular aspect of the trial. And that's unfortunately, I think, something you will see in most trials.
Sisonke, let's talk about femicide in South Africa. How serious is it?
It's obviously a very, very serious issue. And it's serious both from the sheer numbers, the fact that 3 women are killed by an intimate partner every single day. So if we add that up and think about throughout the Riva trial, we were talking about one case, and there are literally thousands that emerged at the very same time that the media spotlight was on Riva. So it's a very serious issue. I think what's also interesting is that it creates a significant workload on the state, or let's say it would create a significant workload if the state were to actually deal with the problem effectively and properly. And so part of what Lisa is highlighting is that if you look at the typical case, a non-celebrity, non-foreigner case, because I think with Diwani, with CNCAMPC, sort of the state coming really sort of like there's an emergency ambulance and suddenly there's a real attention to the issues. But a typical case, we've just been dealing with a case where there were 45 postponements in that case. That a typical case is taking anywhere between 4 and 7 years. We've had this case dealt with in 13 months. So that's the reality of what is so different about this particular case, and why so many of us were hoping that it would show what's possible.
Just on the impact of this case, when Oscar Pistorious is not found guilty of murder, but is found guilty of culpable homicide, is it the same as when I was growing up, there'd be a man beating up his wife, and everyone else would sit back and say, oh, it's a domestic matter, or that's what the police a lot of times say, no, you have to solve it as a family. Isn't that what many people would say would be the effect of this?
No, and I mean, I think this trial illustrated precisely that. You have neighbours who say, we heard a woman screaming, but none of them got up to look and see what happened. So I think the case illustrated that particular attitude that we don't get involved or we roll over continues to persist to this day. I also want to pick up specifically on these cases where men beat women to death, because there are a significant minority of these kinds of cases. And why they are so troubling is that they really do allow men to get away with murder. It's because the man who beats his wife to death typically argues he had the intention to beat her, not kill her. And yet what else can you argue you were meaning to do if you batter someone, beat her on the head with a brick, break her ribs, and still kick her very hard? What else were you thinking of doing? But they continue to be convicted of assault.
What makes these things happen?
What makes these things happen? Gosh, that's the million-dollar question. I think clearly we live in a society where the macho culture is all around us, where it's acceptable for all kinds of forms of violence to be used, not only against women, but men are the biggest victims of violence of men. So I think clearly we live in a macho society where this kind of conduct is acceptable. I mean, for me, one of the most interesting threads in the Oscar Pistorious case was the whole ways in which he constructed this sort of violent black intruder, and that was the real victim. And it's interesting the extent to which the judge in some ways bought into that notion. And obviously, what we know about Oscar Pistorius, regardless of culpable homicide or premeditated murder, what we know is that he had clear anger issues, played with guns a lot, and was part of a group of people for whom that kind of behavior was acceptable. And I think we talk about white men as though they are often the victims of black male violence, and I think in this case we've got a clear example of the ways in which we don't interrogate as society enough white male violence.
Guys, we've got just 1 minute left. Please tell me what happens now. We've seen this case. Hopefully it can have some impact on these issues. Can you tell me what needs to happen legally? What happens in terms of the legislation? If we need better legislation, what needs to happen now?
I'd actually like to talk about the media, because this was one case. There are over 200,000 applications for protection orders made every year. There are 3 women who die every day. I think it would be wonderful if the media went and sat and spent a couple of weeks just filming applications for protection orders and what happens, and sat in an ordinary regional magistrate's court and read the evidence and then watched how an investigation unfolded when a poor woman was beaten to death. That might do a great deal to remind us of what justice ought to be looking like and what the quality of justice currently is being meted out to the majority.
And I completely agree. I think the media coverage has not been optimal, but I also think that we need to put responsibility with the state in terms of prevention. Every time there's a case, we deal with the symptoms. We deal with the back end of it, which is the trial and the criminal justice system, and that is crucial for impunity to go down, but at the same time, we need the state to invest in prevention services.
Sisonke, Lisa Vetten, thanks so much, both of you, for coming through. Stay with us as we ask Holomisa why he wants to see Baleka Mbete kicked out of her position as Speaker of the National Assembly.